Sarah had driven past Mrs. Blackwood's house hundreds of times in the 20 years since Emma's disappearance, but she never noticed the teddy bear in the window until tonight. It sat among dozens of other trinkets behind the bay window. Old toys, jewelry, small antiques, illuminated by a single yellow bulb dangling like an ominous single star in the night. The bear's fur was matted and worn over time, but Sarah would know it anywhere. It was Hugs, the bear she and Emma had shared since they were 4, the one that vanished the same Halloween night her twin sister did. She pulled her car to the curb and killed the engine. Kids in costumes darted and skipped past on the sidewalk, plastic pumpkin buckets swinging, eager to be filled with treats. The row house was the last original Victorian on the street, now dominated by luxury condos. Its faded red brick and sagging porch stood defiantly against gentrification. The same Halloween decorations Sarah remembered from childhood still hung in the windows. Paper cutouts of black cats, construction paper chains in orange and black, and pumpkins cut in strands like one might cut snowflakes. And there was Miss Blackwood herself, a silhouette in the doorway as she handed out candy. The same ominous glow of the single light bulb in the window glowed behind her. She looked almost exactly the same as she had 20 years ago. Tall, thin, with perfectly styled white hair and a floral dress that seemed frozen in the 1950s. Almost exactly the same. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. A small girl in a princess costume skipped up the porch steps. Sarah watched as Mrs. Blackwood bent down, speaking to the child while gesturing at the window display. The girl nodded eagerly and pulled something from her wrist. A bracelet, maybe. Mrs. Blackwood took it and disappeared inside briefly before returning with what looked like a vintage music box. The girl clutched it and bounced back to her waiting parents. The trade game. Sarah had forgotten about that part of Mrs. Blackwood's Halloween tradition. Kids could trade their own trinkets for items from her collection. Emma had been so excited about it that night, even though Sarah had begged her not to take Hugs. "It's not just your bear," Sarah said. "He's ours. I'll trade him for something better," Emma had insisted. "Something that can actually be for both of us." That was the last time Sarah saw her. The library's microfiche machine hummed as Sarah scrolled through decades of local newspapers. She'd been at it for hours, her eyes burning from the blue light. The first article she found was from 1954. Local woman opens home to neighborhood children. The photo showed a younger Mrs. Blackwood standing in front of the house, but her face was exactly the same. She wore a pearl necklace Sarah had seen in the window display just yesterday. She found more articles, Halloween features, human interest stories, and photos of Mrs. Blackwood with neighborhood kids. In each, she wore something Sarah recognized from the current window display: a brooch, a scarf, a pendant. And then she found the other stories. Missing children, scattered across decades. Never more than one every few years. Always explained away somehow. Family troubles, custody disputes, runaways. But as Sarah copied down names and dates, a pattern emerged. Every missing child had visited Mrs. Blackwood's house on Halloween. Everyone had participated in the trade game. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "Please don't start this again. Emma is gone. The police investigated. It doesn't do any good to keep digging." Sarah ignored it and kept scrolling until her eyes landed on a small article from 1956. Local girl still missing. The photo showed a young girl named Lucy Chen, smiling gap-toothed at the camera. Around her neck was half a heart-shaped best friend's necklace. Sarah's hand flew to her neck, where she still wore her half of the necklace she'd shared with Emma. The elderly man who opened the door had deep circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept well in decades. "You got an email about Lucy," he said. It wasn't a question. "You're her brother," Sarah said, "and you've been investigating Mrs. Blackwood, too." James Chen nodded and led her inside. His living room walls were covered with photos, newspaper clippings, and index cards connected by red string. 68 years, he said. "I've tracked every child who ever traded something at that house. Not just the missing ones. The other ones, too." He handed her a thick folder. "Look 'em up online. Social media, public records. Tell me what you see." Sarah spent the next few hours searching names. A pattern quickly emerged. Those who had participated in the trade game shared common traits in their adult lives. Chronic fatigue, memory problems, and difficulty maintaining relationships. Many described feeling like something was missing, though they could never say what. "It's feeding on them," James said quietly. "All of them. Not just the ones it took completely." "What is?" Sarah asked. "I don't know, but it's not Mrs. Blackwood. Not anymore. Maybe not for a long time." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the photos she'd taken in the window display. "I keep seeing these weird lights in the pictures, like threads connecting the objects." James went very still. "You can see them." He pointed to her necklace. "Because you have that, don't you? A connection to something in that house." Sarah touched her half-heart pendant. "My sister, the night she disappeared, we had matching necklaces." "Then you might be able to see what I never could." His hand shook as he gripped her shoulders. "Find out what happened to them. To Lucy. To all of them." Sarah waited until 2 a.m. before approaching the house. The street was silent, except for fallen leaves skittering across the sidewalks. Her half of the heart necklace felt warm against her skin. As she got closer, she could see them. Threads of pale light emanating from every object in the window, pulsing gently like bioluminescent strands. They all led downward, disappearing through the floor. The front door was locked, but Sarah hadn't really expected to use it. Instead, she walked to the window and held up her necklace. The matching half in the display glowed brighter, its threads reaching toward her like curious fingers. When she pressed her necklace to the glass, she felt a sudden vertigo. She felt her body shift to an ethereal form, and she was pulled through the glass. Then, she was inside. The interior was cluttered with shelves and display cases, every surface covered with traded trinkets. In the dark, she could see the threads clearly now, thousands of them, creating a web of ghostly light. They writhed slowly, like seaweed underwater, all flowing downward. Sarah followed them to a door that could only lead to the basement. With each step down the creaking stairs, the air grew colder. The threads converged at the bottom, flowing into a mass of undulating darkness that filled the center of the room. Within it, she could see shapes. Human shapes, suspended and translucent, connected to the objects above by glowing strands. Movement caught her eye. One of the figures was more solid than the others. Young, familiar. "Emma?" Sarah whispered. The figure turned. Her sister's face was exactly as she remembered it, frozen at 13. Emma's eyes widened. "Sarah?" she said. "You can see me? I'm here to get you out." "You can't." Emma's voice was distant and echoing. "It has us all of us, our connections, our emotions, our love. It feeds on us." A floorboard creaked behind Sarah. She spun to find Miss Blackwood, or what wore her face. at the bottom of the stairs. "So much love in that heart," it said in Mrs. Blackwood's voice. "Such a strong connection between twins. It's helped to sustain me for so long." Its face rippled, something darker showing through. "And now, you've brought me the other half of this powerful bond." It reached for Sarah's necklace. Sarah stumbled backward. "What are you?" she yelled. "I am what remains when everything else is gone. I am the hollow place where love used to be." Its fingers elongated into shadowy tendrils. "Your sister gave up her connection willingly. They all did. That's the only way this works." And suddenly, Sarah understood. The thing masquerading as Mrs. Blackwood fed on willing surrender. Children choosing to trade away pieces of their hearts. Adults choosing to keep searching long after hope was gone. A widow choosing to trade her wedding ring to hold on to a dead husband's memory. A painful, endless cycle of people unable to let go. Sarah touched her necklace, then, seeing through the floor, looked up at Emma's matching half in the window display above. "Em," she said softly, "we have to let go." Emma's face crumpled. "I don't want to forget you." "Not forget," Sarah said. "Choose. Choose to release each other." Tears fell from Emma's translucent eyes. "Together?" she asked. Sarah nodded, her own tears falling. "Together." They both reached for their halves of the necklace. Sarah felt 20 years of grief, of desperate clinging, of refusal to move forward. She thought of all the others trapped here, bound by their unwillingness to release what they'd lost. "Let's go," she whispered. The necklace clattered to the floor. In the darkness, Emma smiled. Older now, changing, growing into the years she'd lost. Around them, other spirits began to shift and transform. The threads of light flickered and faded. The thing that wasn't Mrs. Blackwood screamed, its form collapsing as its connections severed, one by one. Those who were bound to her were set free by their own release, something she couldn't fight. The emaciated form of the thing fell to the basement floor. Dark black fractures shot through its body. Then it turned to ash. When it was over, Sarah stood alone in an empty basement. Above, she could hear the sounds of Halloween through the windows. Children laughing, leaves rustling, life moving forward as it always had. She climbed the stairs on shaking legs and stepped out into the cool October night. Behind her, the row house groaned and shuddered. As Sarah walked away, she felt lighter. The weight of endless searching, of desperate clinging, had lifted, and somehow, she knew Emma was finally growing up. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "I had the strangest dream about Emma. She looked happy." Later that year, Mrs. Blackwood's house was demolished for new construction. Its secrets were eventually buried under new condos. Throughout life, we all collect important, precious gifts. But there will always come a time when we must let those gifts go. Thanks for letting me get in my feels with this story. I think we all share this quiet strength from things we've lost, from people that are gone. But in a really beautiful way, we don't go anywhere. I hope you have a great time celebrating this unique, special time of year, and I hope that your collection of experiences and memories grows. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are a handful of ways you can do so. The first of which is just sharing this podcast with your friends and families, telling them about it, maybe sharing a link, letting them know what you like about it. The second way you can help is by leaving a rating or review on whatever streaming service you're listening to this on. The third way is by joining us over on Patreon, where you get early access to episodes, some behind-the-scenes glimpses at what makes these stories work, and a handful of other things. However you choose to support, I cannot thank you enough. I'll have a new tale for you very soon. Happy Halloween, and keep creating.